your journey into the heart and soul of Greece. And now, member-supported Hellenic Public Radio CosmosFM 91.5, a bilingual Greek-American radio program coming to you every day through WNYE 91.5 FM. From the Demetrius and Georgia Kaloidis Broadcasting Studios to the greater New York area and worldwide through CosmosFM.org. Our programs air Monday through Friday from 7 to 8 p.m., Saturdays from noon to 3:30 p.m., and Sunday mornings from 9 to 1:30 p.m.
At a time when the age-old institution of marriage is questioned and even denounced by some, perhaps it is worthwhile to take a step back into time and to rediscover the traditions and ideas that made marriage what it has become. The journey will begin in ancient Greece and make its way into Rome, Constantinople, and around the world. Our guide for the occasion, the reliable Esmeralda Mourikis. All that is next in a special edition of Musical Masterworks.
Musical Masterworks, a program dedicated to the rediscovery of great symphonic, instrumental, choral, operatic, cinematic, and electronic compositions from antiquity to the present, with your host, Mike Stratis.
And good evening. This is Mike Stratis, host of Musical Masterworks, but tonight's a special edition of Musical Masterworks, the time we look at a lot of historical events and traditions and other interesting themes. And of course, the person that I always call for this occasion is, as I called her, the ever so reliable Esmeralda Mourikis. Good evening, Esmeralda.
Good evening, Mike. It's always a pleasure to be in your show. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. And it's always a pleasure to have you here. I started off by saying we're going to be taking a look from ancient Greece, Rome, Constantinople, and around the world on the subject of the traditions of marriage. Mm-hmm. And it's a fascinating topic. You and I were talking about this, and I think it's something that in this time period is quite an appropriate thing, because we tend to take marriage for granted. We think we know everything about it, and then we discover these fascinating details about it. And you're here to tell us, starting from the beginning of our world, the ancient Greek world, how this actually began. So take it away.
Since we're beginning with ancient Greece, let's briefly refer to the gods who were protecting the sanctity of marriage.
Yes.
Plutarch names 4 gods: Zeus, Hera, Python, Artemis.
And if I may interject here, I think most people would know Zeus, Hera, and Artemis, but most would not know the name Python. And for the sake of clarification, Python is the goddess of persuasion and seduction. Interesting how he fits that into the whole marriage argument. Go ahead, Esmeralda.
And since Hera was called Gamilia, that means related to the marriage, the couples used to get married during Hera's sacred month, which was called Gamilion. And Gamilion relates to January, but it was not the month of the year. It was actually the 7th month.
Oh, the 7th month is January. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And let's also refer to the patron of marriage, Hymenaeus, a handsome young man. We can see him on a wall painting in Pompeii, holding a wreath with his right hand and a big candle with his left hand. This is a tradition which is kept until today in religious ceremonies. We have the wreath, we have the candle. And by the way, when Alexander the Great married Roxanne, the painter Aetion, who was present at the ceremony, drew a painting and included also Hymenaeus in it. This painting is described by Lucianos, and it inspired, and it inspired the Renaissance painters Raphael and Sodoma. Sodoma's painting is based on a drawing of Raphael, and on this painting we can see Alexander giving his bride the royal crown, as Hymenaeus and Alexander's best friend Hephaestion are watching.
From what I understand, the concept of Hymenaeus is always something that is brought up in marriage. And if I'm not mistaken, he was a big theme in some of the lyric poets of the ancient Greek world, from,
correct,
I guess, from Sappho all the way to Anacreon. And you also find him in English literature, in some of the romantic poets who always make reference to this fascinating god. Continue, please.
Mm-hmm. And the word Hymenaeus is also the song to honor the bride. Homer and Hesiod also refer to the word Hymenaeus as a bridal song. So we are still using a word as it is from ancient times, Hymenaeus.
Right.
In ancient Greece, the purpose of marriage was to preserve the lineage and the fortune. They did not see it as an act of love or togetherness. And this is why in the ancient law, the woman is lesser than the man. And so we have 2 different verbs to describe the act of getting married. For the woman, we have the verb υπανδρεύομαι. That means I am below the man. Υπανδρεύομαι, υπό τον άνδρα. I am below the man. And for the man, we have the verb γαμαίο γαμό, which unfortunately became a vulgar term in modern Greek.
Right, that's right.
If we read the beginning of Ευρυπίδης, Ιφηγένεια, and Tavris, we do find this verb. Πέλοψ ο Ταντάλιος εις πίσαν μολών, θωέ συνήπης, η νομάου γαμή κόρην εξής ατρεύς έβλαστεν. Pelops, the son of Tantalus, after he came to Pisa, married the daughter of Inomaus.
So we can say that the concept in ancient Greece of marriage is pretty much one of preservation and maintenance of, like you said in the beginning, property and status. And sadly, the modern notion of romance and togetherness and companionship is absolutely missing. But of course, that's not 100%. It's missing.
Not.
Of course, there's some exceptions. Yeah. Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Continue.
In ancient law, we also see monogamy. Meanwhile, the man could have a mistress or he could have mistresses. And according both to the Spartan and to the Athenian law, people who did not want children were listed in a book called Graphi Agamiou, something like a blacklist. Wow. And in Sparta, they had also another book for people who married at an advanced age and could not have children anymore. Another blacklist here. This was called Graphi Oxygamiou.
Right.
And since for ethical reasons the children had to make all the arrangements for their parents' funeral, as Plato and Hesiod write, if the couple did not have children, they were adopting. Also, the parents had to educate the children, and the children had the obligation to take care of their old parents.
And that's, I guess, where the word gyrovosko, to shepherd one's old parents, comes from, correct?
Correct, yeah, gyrovosko. Unless if the parents did not educate the children or did something extremely moral, like in rare cases forcing them into prostitution. And of course, the children who were not legitimate did not have the obligation to take care of their old parents. But in any case, they all still had to attend the funeral of both parents.
I find that a fascinating feature because there is clearly a distinction that even illegitimate children are required by moral laws to attend the funeral of parents that have not gone as far as legally embracing them. That is an absolutely important moral tradition that society seems to be emphasizing here. And sometimes we seem to lack these moral laws in our own times where we don't take a position. But I just find that very fascinating. Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
The most ancient form of marriage is the abduction or the purchase of a woman by the groom. Let's remember Homer, HELLENIC.
Right,
and
the abduction of Helen, right.
The abduction of Helen. And in a symbolic way, in Sparta, the man was abducting the woman even after gaining approval for marriage from her father. And as for the purchase, we can read in Homer that the man, after signing the nuptial agreement, had to give presents to the father of the bride, which were called Edna, and the father of the bride had to give to the groom Tamilia, which is the ancestor of the dowry. Then, in front of witnesses, they were placing the man's and the woman's palms together, and from that moment on, they were legally husband and wife. And after this, they celebrated the entrance of the bride in the groom's house.
Esmeralda, if I may cut in here for a second, I find it fascinating again that we have clear contractual foundations in this nuptial agreement where it is expected that the groom presents gifts to the father of the bride and that the father of the bride in exchange must give this milia, this ancestor of the dowry. That is your legal contractual foundations of the marriage here. Once again, emphasizing how, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, there is clearly no romantic, individualistic perception of marriage. It's constantly coming out here. Yeah, go ahead.
During the post-Homeric years now, there were two kinds of marriages. The one was the guarantee, engiesis. They were signing, again, a nuptial agreement, and then the father or the guardian was giving the woman away. Without this act, the married couple's children were not legal, and they were also giving the dowry to the groom. As for the bride, she had to marry the man her father had pre-chosen.
There we go.
As we read in Evripidis Andromachi, verse 987. Νυμφευμάτων μεν των εμών πατήρ μος μέριμναν έξι, κουκ εγώ κρίνειν τάδε. In other words, my father will take care of my marriage. It's not up to me to decide. If the woman thought she's forced to an unfit marriage, she could accuse the father or the guardian. And of course, the son could marry any girl he wanted without his father's permission. As for the second kind of marriage, this was called adjudication, epidikasia, and it applied to the girl whose father had died and she did not have a brother. In that case, the fortune would go to her after she had given birth to boys. So it was better for a woman to marry a relative.
Wow, to keep the property in the family. Wow.
The woman in both kinds of marriage followed the social status of the man. She resided in his house only if he was also her lord. This was a special title arranged before or after the marriage. If her husband was not also her lord, she could reside in her house. And as for the children, they followed the social status of their father, unless the woman was a foreigner. And in case of a divorce, the dowry remained with the woman, and if the man died, the dowry went to his children, and this is why the man pledged the dowry upon marriage.
This is fascinating, Esmeralda, because there's so much at work here besides preservation of property. There's also preservation of citizenship, the whole denial of the foreign woman's rights. It just
correct,
and I see this in many cases in ancient times, especially in the case of ancient Athens, where a lot of discussion. Right, you find that whole discussion around the status of Aspasia, who was the mistress, and then probably later the second wife of Pericles, the great Athenian statesman. And of course, there was so much animosity at the fact that she was a foreigner. What does a foreigner in that case mean? A Greek outside of Athens. And she was from Asia Minor for sure, an Asia Minor Greek. Yeah. Well, what then, according to the ancients, since this is a big topic even for today, was the best age for marriage?
Well, there are a lot of differences of opinions here. Plato believes that a girl should not get married before the age of 20 and a man not before the age of 30. So there is a gap of 10 years here.
Right.
If a girl marries at the age of 20, she had to marry somebody who was 30 already. So, but not more than 10 years. As for Hesiod, he made that gap a little bit bigger. He thought that a girl should not get married before the age of 15 and a man not before the age of 28. So we have a 13-year gap there.
That's a big gap, you see, from 10 to 13. But if I'm not mistaken, and I looked this up, Aristotle suggests that women marry at 18, at least 18, and men at 37.
So, 19 years.
That's a 19-year difference. And then Solon suggests 18 for a woman and a man at 35, a 17-year gap.
Oh, so 17 years.
It's right. So it seems that there's an expectation that the man must be a mature individual, almost double the age in some cases, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct, yes.
Okay, Esmeralda, tell me then about the wedding ceremony.
Well, it lasted for 3 days. And although it was called sacred, the wedding was called sacred, it was not religious. The first day was called proavlia, and that was the day the bride had to say goodbye to her unmarried life, and she had to dedicate her toys and a curl of her hair to the goddess of marriage. And at night, she had the bridal bathing, lutrophoria.
And it's probably the case that this lutrophoria is proven to be at night because there were torches involved. That's correct?
Yes, yes. And the water was always brought from the river by a child from the side of the bride. So on the second day, o Kyrios Gamos, they used to decorate the house of the bride with garlands and myrtle wreaths, and the main entrance as well. And then the bride was getting dressed, and she wore also a veil. And after the offering to the gods, the dinner followed in the father of the bride's home.
And that would be the gamodesia or the thini gamiki, the banquet, right?
Correct. There was a woman who was in charge for the ceremony. She was called Demiurgos, creator. And she had to bake something like a pie made out of sesame called gamikos plakous. And that was a symbol of fertility. And the bridesmaid escorted the bride to the table. The veil was lifted after the dinner, and then the groom had to give his presents, and the couple was escorted to the groom's house with torches. If this was the groom's second marriage, he was not allowed to escort the bride, and she could walk to his house. There, the friends would sprinkle the couple with nuts, which were called tragimata, and give them quince to eat, milon kidonion. The quince is a symbol of Venus.
Right.
During the couple's first night, the bride's best friend was guarding the room, and young girls were singing in front of the closed door. And the third day, which was called Epavlia, the bride was given the presents, shoes, perfumes, dresses, even a compass. And then the man would take the dowry, offer to the gods, and host the dinner.
I have to stop you here. Esmeralda, I have to stop you here.
Yes.
A compass. Now, let's put a little explanation, giving a compass as a gift. Well, I was fascinated with this, and I assumed the compass has something to do with the four corners of the horizon, the north, south, east, west.
Exactly.
So some form of Greek feng shui to balance out the four basic elements: earth, wind, fire, water. It's amazing. It really is amazing.
Correct. And let's also not forget that in money, the groom never accepted a dowry. And we, of course, see a lot of these customs and until the 20th century.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, it goes on even into today, our times, the 21st century, because I have seen a lot of these things personally taking place. I've been very fortunate from the time when I got married to have experienced some of these modern forms of these ancient concepts, the whole progression from day to day and from relatives who've gone through similar scenarios. The one day you have the family of the bride, the next day is the family of the groom, the third day is possibly extra days added on even. I would go as far as maybe as much as a week in some cases.
Oh.
And of course, the presence of the cake. The cake is an ancient example. You've got the escorting of the groom. I know in my wife's parts of Greece, in Kozani and Kastoria, they accompany the groom from his house after he gets shaven with a band of halkina and brass instruments, and they take him to the church, and then they do the same to the nifi. So a lot of this, to cut it short, is very much alive and well in many places in Greece. Mm-hmm. And just one last thing, I love this whole reference to the nuts and the quince. Fascinating how the nuts symbols of fertility and the quince is a bitter-sweet reminder that life is not all sweetness. There are moments of bitterness as well. That people need to be realistic. That's fascinating. Mm-hmm. Yes, continue.
And we should also not forget that they were always considering marriage to be predestined.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. And of course, we said that the best day for marriage was Sunday, right?
Sunday, correct. Yes, Sunday.
And when would weddings generally be encouraged throughout the year?
They were avoiding May and September.
Oh, I see. I see. Okay. So, and that's fascinating how a lot of the restrictions, we have a lot of religious restrictions today through the church, but in ancient times, I'm sure there are different rationales for that. What about now, I think we're pretty good with ancient Greece. And of course, ancient Rome tends to pick up a lot of these ideas. But where is ancient Rome moving in a somewhat different direction? Go ahead. Tell me about that.
In Rome, they had to do the engagement first, which was called sponsalia. The man put a golden ring on the woman's middle finger, and if he broke the engagement, then he had to compensate the woman. And in order to have another engagement, he had to annul the first one. If not, it was considered as an act of dishonesty, infamia.
Right.
The marriage, which was called justum, juste nuptiae, or legitimum matrimonium, was not allowed between a free person and a slave, a mother and a child, even if the child was adopted, a brother and a sister, an uncle and a niece, and also between people with physical disabilities. And whoever was married and wanted to marry again, he had to wait for his divorce to be finalized. And until the mid-5th century BC, a marriage between a man and a woman of different social status was not allowed.
And that was the famous Lex Canulia, the law that was passed by the Roman Senate, which allowed the patricians and the plebeians to marry for the first time.
Yes. There was a religious wedding ceremony in Rome, but only for patricians. The woman was subordinate to the man in manu viri, and there was also an iconic purchase of the woman in remembrance of Homer. And they also had the so-called trinoctium, which means in order for the woman to avoid being subordinate to the man, she could leave her husband's house 3 nights every year.
Wow.
The subordinate woman was like a daughter in her husband's house. But in order to be subordinate, her husband had to have her father's consent. And of course, she had to be obedient and loyal. The night before the wedding, she had to dedicate her robe and her toys to the gods who were protecting her family. And for the ceremony, she was dressed in a long white gown with red ribbons and a belt around her waist with a knot called nodus herculeus. And her husband would untie this knot at night.
And that would be the famous knot of Hercules, right, as a symbol?
Correct, yes.
Okay.
The bride wore also a red veil, which was called flammeum. The augury followed, and then the nuptial agreement was signed, also by the 10 witnesses who were present. And after the signing, they would place the bride's right hand on the groom's right hand while the augur was praying. And then the couple sacrificed either an ox or a hog while the guests were crying out loud, Feliciter.
Which today we would say, congratulations to the couple.
Mm-hmm. The dinner followed, Kena, and after the dinner, the bride was escorted to the groom's house with musicians, songs, and torches.
And those songs, from what historians and literary personalities write, were very bawdy, naughty songs, right?
Correct.
Yeah, yes.
As for the entrance was spread with oil and fat and covered with woolen ribbons. And a man lifted up the bride to bring her inside the house, and her husband would give her water and fire, the symbols of togetherness and adoration. And the day after, the bride hosted the dinner for her parents and made the first offering to the gods who were protecting her new home. And we should mention that there were no weddings in ancient Rome in May, because May was the month of the underground deities.
That's interesting. If I interject here, Esmeralda, some interesting observations I made along the way. First of all, the young bride giving her toys marks the end of her youthfulness, her era of being a child, and now she's being a woman. Very fascinating point, toys being involved. Secondly, there is this reference to the month of May, which I guess some people would probably connote with the Psychosavata in the Christian period, where there's a deference to religious obligations for the dead. And the third thing I wanted to bring up is, we didn't mention it here, but abduction has a tradition even in ancient Rome. And from what I found, the beginning of Roman history starts with a very famous event called the abduction of the Sabine women, in which these neighboring tribes had daughters who, as we find out from the great Roman historian Livy, Romulus, the first leader of Rome, had a shortage of women. And so he encouraged his men to go into the Sabine territories, and at a given festival, they would then abduct the daughters of these men and bring them as wives. And of course, a war broke out. But eventually, at the end, the women were very happy with their new husbands, and they brought peace to the two people. Fascinating how abduction plays its role. So the next phase of Roman history is known as the Eastern Roman period, which we connote with and connect with Constantinople. So let's go to Constantinople.
Where there, the legal age for a boy to marry was 14, and for the girl, 12 or 13. weddings did not take place in May. Again, here we see the same thing. And also, they did not take place when the moon was proceeding towards Cancer, Leo, Virgo, or Libra. And at first, the wedding was civil. It became religious towards the end of the 9th century. Again, the father was the one to decide for his daughter. And if she didn't want to marry the man her father had chosen, he could curse her or even become violent.
Wow.
There were also matchmakers, but they were not respected. And we have here a kind of engagement, especially for minors. They were signing a nuptial agreement, and if the man would break it, there was a penalty for him. Later, the engagement included also a ring and a kiss. And of course, the dowry played a big part. Golden coins, textiles the bride had weaved by herself, servants, furniture, homes, even animals. And the groom had also to secure his bride in case of death, the so-called theoritron. The wedding took always place on a Sunday, but the preparation started the Thursday before. It was the day they were decorating the couple's room, pastopigia. On Sunday, the bride wore white and golden dresses and a lot of jewelry, and musicians were playing in her house. And the groom used to dye his hair and his eyebrows if he was older, and upon his arrival at the bride's home, he was welcomed with apples and pomegranates. And then they all started walking to the church, the bride lingering behind.
And that happens today where the groom waits for the bride, right?
Yes. And all the guests were sprinkling the couple with pomegranate seeds and flowers. And after the wedding, the groom's mother was welcoming the bride at the door, and she was the one to escort the couple inside their marital chamber after the dinner.
That's a very similar scenario in some cases to what we've seen in the Roman period, the reference to the ring being a part of the engagement. That's the first time we hear talk about a ring, and we see it continued in Constantinople. Of course, that goes on until today. The other thing that I found really interesting, and since this is moving towards the Eastern Roman period where Christianity is the established religion, you find this emphasis on astrological considerations, which is a very fascinating reality, even though there is established religious practice. I just find how so much of what we see today is continued from this time period. I mean, the dowry, the prika, as we say, the choice of, not just the coins, but also the rugs that were weaved by the bride. I mean, it's just the furniture. I mean, that goes on in some of the villages of Greece today. Well, Esmeralda, you've provided me a very fascinating map of where this tour goes forward. And we have a lot of interesting locations to look at from here. So let's start off with the very first group that I want to take a look at. And it's just right across the Eastern Mediterranean to the land of Israel. Let's talk about the Jews. What about the Jews?
The bride there was purchased by the groom again. She had to wear a black veil to remind her of the veil Rebecca was wearing when she was looking at Isaac.
Right.
And she was escorted to the groom, who was also wearing black, mourning the loss of the Solomon Temple and also the loss of Jerusalem. And they were drinking from the same glass. They would break it, and they would place a golden ring on their finger. And then the agreement had to be signed, and the guests would sprinkle the couple with wheat seeds. And this was the end of the ceremony, which was not religious.
Right. That's a big point there. That's a big, interesting point to say, that it's a non-religious ceremony. Well, the next place I've got here is Abyssinia. Abyssinia to the south in Africa, in the Golden Horn, today's Ethiopia. Talk about the Ethiopians, please.
A man could marry any woman he wanted, and he could also abandon her. let's talk about Kuranko.
Kuranko, that would be the tribe that's found in Guinea and Sierra Leone.
Mm-hmm. The girl would marry an old man, and after his death, she could marry anybody she chose. Young, of course. Let's talk about Nubia.
That would be today's Sudan.
Correct. They had the 3/4 marriage. 3 out of 4 days, the woman belonged to her husband, and the 4th day, she could do whatever she liked. Shall we go to China?
Yes, please do.
They used to mourn for 3 days before the wedding because the marriage of the children meant that the end of the parents was near. Let's have a look at Malabar.
That would be the western coastal area of India.
Correct. Every woman had 5 to 10 men, so she could sleep with all of them, but not at the same time. She had to spend 10 days with each man.
So we have the opposite of polygamy. This is polyandry, right?
Polyandria.
All right.
And as for Tibet, when the girl agreed to marry a man, she had to rub butter on his forehead, and he had to rub butter on her forehead.
Wow, that's a fascinating scenario. I have to tell you, I'm listening to some of these things in my mind, and I'm really getting a kick out of this. But unfortunately, at this point, we have to take a break. So we will take a break and return with more about traditions of marriage. And welcome back to a special edition of Musical Masterworks, where the topic has been marriage, the traditions of marriage, starting from ancient times into modern times. And we've been looking at some of the traditions around Greece, having finished the look at the ancient and medieval Greek traditions. And now we're taking a look at the opposite side of the world. Let's take a look at the Aborigines of Australia. Esmeralda, who, by the way, Esmeralda has been our guest tonight, and she has been providing a lot of fascinating information about these people. Are you there, Esmeralda?
I am here, Mike.
Good. So talk about the Aborigines.
The woman was abducted by the man. He owned her, and he could do with her anything he wanted. He could give her to a friend, or he could also rent her.
Wow. That's again, there's that sense of subordination that exists. Do you have something about the Polynesians in New Caledonia, which is in the Pacific, just to the northeast of Australia?
Every man there, whether he was married or not, had to marry his brother's widow.
Oh boy! Wow! That changes the whole definition of in-law. I have to say that's fascinating. Not necessarily something people would like, but since you're already family, I guess with the concepts of property being involved, there is always something to say about that. Let's go to the eastern reaches of the Pacific, to Mexico. Anything there?
Here, a duel between 2 men took place. Except for the aristocrats, who would have many wives, but only one was legal. And as for the Otomi, who were farmers in Sierra Madre, they were monogamous, and they were the only ones who were monogamous.
I'm assuming, Esmeralda, we're talking about the pre-Columbian peoples who were natives to the area, right?
Yes.
And so the next question is, what about the other North American native peoples? Anything about them?
They used to perform an iconic battle on the wedding day for the abduction of the bride, and they also used to represent scenes of the future life of the couple with all the joys and possible sorrows.
Fascinating how there's always a sense of competition for a woman and also a sense of abduction. You find that constantly throughout this conversation today. And what about, let's go to another group. Let's go to the Celtic peoples, who, if you don't know, Celtic peoples are from the area of, I'd say, Ireland, Britain, and some of the other locations in Europe. Yes.
The woman was the one to choose her husband.
Interesting.
The candidates went to her house, and she gave a cup with a sweet drink to the man she had chosen. And then the other candidates had to leave, and this was the end of the ceremony.
That's fascinating how the Celtic woman is the one who determines so much interesting differences here.
Very
and if I'm
interesting.
not mistaken, the only other comparison would probably be in my mind in the Minoan period, from what I know, where the women had a greater role to play. But it's fascinating how the Celts have that distinctive exception. Now let's go to a group that I would not assume to be like the Celts, the Tatars, who, by the way, the Tatars are a Turco-Mongolian people that inhabited the steppe and probably the medieval period. What do you have about them?
They covered the bride with a veil, and they asked her to stay silent. The relatives were crying, and her unmarried friends were trying to pull her back to them. They fought, and at the end, when the bride succeeded to escape, she was escorted to the groom's house, where he would see her for the first time around midnight. And similar things happened in Java, but the bride had also to kneel down and wash her husband's feet.
Wow. And for those of you listening, Java would be one of the islands in Indonesia. Again, this sense of resisting the event. Of course, it's all ceremonial, because in the end, the point is to let her go to her husband. Again, fascinating. Let's focus on more of the European world. Some of the other European peoples that we haven't mentioned, in addition to the Celts, the Greeks, and the Romans. What do you have about them?
Well, let's go to Finland.
Yes.
The girl wore a sword case around her hips, and the man who wanted to marry her had to insert the same size sword in the case.
Wow, that's very different from everything we've seen so far. Symbolic gestures, of course. Anything on Lithuania?
Lithuania, yeah. After the ceremony, they turned the bride 3 times around the center of the house. Then she had to sit. They washed her feet, and with the water, they sprinkled the bed and the rest of the furniture. And then they put honey on her lips. They blindfolded her, and they guided her in front of every door of the house, which she had to kick with her right leg.
And let's look at another Scandinavian region, Lapland, which is predominantly found in Norway.
Well, there, even after the wedding ceremony, prophecy was a must. So the older relative used to go inside a hut and used to hit repeatedly a big piece of iron on a stone. And if a sparkle came out, this was a good omen. The marriage would be a happy one. We have to say, in general, among the ancient Europeans, the marriage was like a trade. And as for the medieval years, if the woman was not loyal to her husband, it was considered a crime, and she had to be killed. As for monogamy, monogamy prevailed after all because due to financial difficulties, a man could not support many women. Still, Luther and the Pope Gregory II allowed polygamy.
Yeah, that's mind blasting to allow polygamy. I mean, being a Christian preacher and the Pope of the Catholic Church, I'm assuming they're actually using biblical references to
Could be, I don't know.
Interpret an allowance for it. But I'm sure that their view is in a very small minority. Yeah. But if I'm not mistaken, the Germans actually reestablished something very important at this time. What would that be, Esmeralda?
If I'm not mistaken, the Germans are the ones who reintroduced the engagement.
Right. That says a lot. It's bringing it back from ancient times into the modern world. Then there is the well-known traditions of the opposite of monogamy, which is polygamy. We know that historically the Muslims of the Middle East had an acceptance of polygamy in their early form. And we also know in more recent times, in the 19th century, the case of the Mormons. They practiced polygamy for a period of time, and by the time they reached Utah and established themselves there, one of the considerations for joining the Union would have been the prohibition of polygamy according to the law of the United States. And so we find that the Mormons gave up polygamy officially to join the United States of America. And there we have it. We come to the end of another show. This is the special edition of Musical Masterworks with my guest, Esmeralda Mourikis. A big thank you, Esmeralda, for being here again.
I thank you very much, Mike. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You always bring us some fascinating information. It's a big thank you goes out to you. I'll be back again in 2 weeks. Until then, have a wonderful night.